Now here's a pair of 22 centerfire Giants. Let's set the Wayback Machine to about 1910. Welcome back. Today I want to introduce a grand old cartridge, the 220 Swift. A number of people have asked me if I would talk about the 220 Swift, and I've basically been waiting to get my grubby paws on my buddy's fine Ruger #1. It's a 26-inch heavy barrel varminter. Gorgeous rifle, and we're going to take a look at that as soon as I can here in a moment. I was really hoping to put this off until we could get out and do some shooting at the range, and but right now it's 4 degrees. It doesn't look like things are going to get much better for the next few weeks, so I just want to get this video out to you, and we can follow up and do a shooting video with it later on. But the 220 Swift's development really followed on the heels of the fervor that was developing in the early 1900s with new cartridge development. So around about 1910, now remember the number here, 1910. That's a long time ago. We're talking, you know, 109 years ago. For those of you who might think that, you know, rifle technology is something new, we're talking a century ago. We're dealing with this sort of technology. So there's nothing new under the sun here. Most of what we're working with these days was already developed by the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, and we just kind of polished the apple up a little bit, and you know, have refined things, a little bit better bullet technology. We've had better primer technology. We've introduced a host of new different powders, but you know, we're actually still using some of those powders that were in use back then. Some of those improved military rifle powders that were developed by DuPont. So you know, we're very fortunate to have this history of firearms development, but we have to remember that you know, we can't be too proud of ourselves, because a lot of it was something that was done a long time ago by our great-great-grandfathers. So anyway, in 1910, Arthur Savage, the owner of the Savage, the proprietor of the Savage Arms Company, wanted to have some new cartridges to fill his Model 99 lever action. Now, I have a video on the Model 99 lever action that I spoke about some years back, and I encourage you to watch that. But Arthur Savage wanted to have some new cartridges, so he employed the services of Charles Newton, who was a noted rifle designer and cartridge designer himself. Well, Charles Newton came up with about three different cartridges. One was based on a neck down 30-30 rimmed case, and neck down to a rather odd sized bullet. But in those days, you know, we didn't have too many standardizations, so there was really no such thing as odd. Everybody was inventing something basically from scratch in those days. But it was a 228 diameter bullet. And the 228 diameter bullet loaded into that neck down 30-30 case became known as the 22 high power, HI-power. And that was a very successful varmint cartridge for quite a long time. If memory serves me right, I think it was a 70 grain bullet. It was a rather heavy bullet, and it was actually used as a dual purpose cartridge by some people for deer. Now the other cartridge that he developed was from a sawed-off 30-06 case, or you might say a sawed-off 7mm Mauser case or whatever, and necked down to a 257 diameter bullet, and that became the very famous 253,000 Savage. The 3,000 Savage, as I've said sometimes, that 3,000 alludes to the 87 grain bullet which hit the gong at 3,000 feet per second. That was the first 3,000 foot per second cartridge in firearms history, commercially produced. So America was on its way to really, you know, there were stars in our eyes looking at these fabulous velocities. People started to really get, you know, amazed, and you know, they were able to shoot at targets far beyond anything that they were used to. The people who were shooting this stuff, remember, came from the black powder days when they were lobbing lead balls with patches and stuff. So this was very exciting stuff to be able to shoot high velocity centerfire cartridges at 3,000 feet per second and such. So there was a third cartridge that was developed. Now the Savage High Power was developed released to the public in 1912, and the 250-3000 Savage, which is commonly called the 250 Savage, that was introduced 3 years later. That was called in 1915. But there was a third cartridge which was basically neck down. It was like the 250-3000 Savage case, but that was also neck down to the 228 diameter bullet. Well, Savage apparently never introduced that one, and he never went to market with it. But a number of years later, in the late 1920s, a gentleman by the name of Jerry Gebbe, who was also a very popular figure in rifle and cartridge design, he was visiting Newton, and the story goes that he happened to spot a cigar box full of different things that discarded prototypes that Newton had been working on, and he grabbed hold of that one that had been rejected by Savage, that had never gone to market, that 22 caliber with the 250-3000 case, that sawed-off 30-06 case. So he went one further step, and he necked it down to 224 diameter bullet, and that's your 22-250. The 22-250 round is exactly that cartridge that Gebbe had designed, and that right there is that's a very popular cartridge. It's remained popular ever since it was finally released to the public. In 1965 is when it was released formally by Remington, but it had been played with as a Wildcat cartridge and chambered very uniformly through the years, all from the late 1920s until 1965. Actually, 1963, 64 is when Browning first introduced their own rifle with it, without even having a commercial cartridge to go along with it. And I spoke about that in my 22-250 video. Well, the story further goes that Gebbe introduced that cartridge to Winchester. Winchester has always been known as being a rather independent firearms company that didn't use too much of anybody else's technology. Browning was their principal developer of the lever action rifle, but he was employed by Winchester, and everything was an in-house project. The development of different cartridges basically was an in-house thing, and they didn't share too much technology, and they didn't borrow too much from other sources. So, when they developed their rimmed cartridge series, the 30-30 and the 32 Special and all those things, those were all their own. The 270 Winchester, though it was, though it had all the appearance of a 30-06, and it had that same basic case form that was neck down, you're talking essentially about a cartridge which they released on their own, and they didn't go to anybody else outside the factory walls to get their inventions. And the 22-250 was, at the time, Gebbe had introduced it with the name Varminter, and he had patented the name Varminter, but he didn't patent the entire 22-250 Varminter. So gunsmiths were just routinely turning out rifles, leaving out the word Varminter and just putting 22-250 on the barrels, and they got away with that. So he basically had dropped the reins, and he had lost control of his own invention. So when he went to Winchester, he was hoping, I'm sure, that Winchester would take off with this, and he would, this would be part of his legacy. So Winchester probably had stars in their eyes. The 22-250 was running around 3,800, 3,850, depending on which powders we used. The popular powders in those days were probably giving it around 3,850 feet per second with a 50 grain bullet, which is a little slower these days than you could probably do with most 50 grain bullet loads. But you know, that's not very far from another magical figure, the 4,000 foot per second mark. Winchester basically ran with their own invention, and they grabbed hold of the 6mm Lee Navy case, and that's a semi-rimmed case, and they necked that down, and they changed the taper of the body a little bit, straightened it out a little bit, and that became the famed 220 Swift. Now the 220 Swift is a somewhat more slender cartridge at the base than the 22-250, and it's longer by about 7/10 of an inch. Uses the same 224 diameter bullet, but Winchester also, they really slammed the door behind them on this thing, because they reduced the bullet weight by a couple of grains. So a 48 grain bullet, they were able to really knock its socks off with 4,110 feet per second. That was an absolutely stunning velocity to the public, and they gobbled it up like crazy. You know, nobody could get their hands on it quick enough. So about as fast as it became popular, Swift being the term here, it started to decline in popularity because the steels used in the early barrels tended to be a little bit on the soft side and deteriorated pretty quickly with those high velocity rounds. And you know, gun writers have a way of exacerbating something that's already bad. So you know, the slightest hint that maybe something was declining in the 220 Swift barrels meant that everybody had to, you know, make it a big deal, and you know, so it was written about and written about and written about. So bad news travels faster than good news, and very shortly the 220 Swift popularity started to suffer. Winchester brought it out in the Model 54, their Model 54 bolt-action rifle, and eventually when the Model 70 came out, they introduced it with eventually with stainless steel barrels, and the stainless steel barrels were a, you know, better formulation of alloy, and they withstood the temperatures and the erosion of the 220 Swift a lot better. But by then, you know, a lot of the damage had been done, and some of the shine had gotten off of the 220 Swift. The reputation that it had preceded it. And then around 1950, Mike Walker came out with Remington's 222 Remington, and that pretty much nailed the lid shut for the 220 Swift. There was still some adherence, there was still some very, very strong popularity for the 220 Swift, but it was declining, and the 222 Remington was really causing some problems for it on the market. Though it had significantly lower velocity. We're talking about 3,200 feet per second versus almost 4,200 feet per second. Still, for the average person who's the woodchuck shooter and things like that, it was enough for them. And the 220 Swift can be a raucous gun to set off. You know, you're going to let your neighbors know about it. It's a very loud cartridge. It's significantly louder than a 22-250, which is significantly louder than a 222. So all these things together meant that the 220 Swift's popularity started to decline pretty rapidly, and by 1964, when Winchester switched over from the so-called pre-64 model to their extractorless design bolt, and they had gone to a little bit simpler style Model 70 design. They had by then taken the 220 Swift off the market, and they replaced it with the 225 Winchester, which By the way, you probably have never even seen or heard of one, because that died on the vine almost immediately. It just hit the headwinds of the 22-250 head on, and that was the end of the story. But the 220 Swift is a super fine cartridge. It's known to be extremely accurate. In fact, you know, with its full power loads, it has a reputation of maybe having a slight edge on the 22-250 accuracy-wise in a number of cases. On average, you know, you can get very fine accuracy with the 22-250, which has always been popular amongst varminters, and even for a number of years was a good bench rest cartridge. And some bench resters still bring it to the range because, you know, it's just a fun gun to shoot. But the 220 Swift, I'll show you again, the 220 Swift is known for being very, very strong performer with 55 grain bullets. The velocity, knocking the velocity down is greatly recommended by maybe knocking it down by only 100 feet per second or so. And that will really preserve the barrel quite a bit, and take the punishment edge off the barrel. 220 Swift they shouldn't have the reputation that they gained back in 1935 when it was introduced. And if I didn't mention that, that's when Winchester actually introduced the 220 Swift, was in 1935. It's a fine cartridge, and anybody who has a 220 Swift knows that they shoot very, very accurately, and they're not tough on barrels at all, as long as you don't abuse them. You know, if you're trying to ring the gong every time with a 4,200 foot per second load with 45 grain bullets or something, it's going to take a beating. You know, between the amount of powder that you're using, the erosion, the heat that's produced, the pressure, and the bullet speed. You know, the three things that cause barrel deterioration are, first of all, heat. I've said this before: heat, powder erosion, and bullet friction. So you can bring all three of those things down a little bit by just toning down the numbers if you're hand loading, and keeping it a little bit cooler. So popular loads for it now tend to be with the 55 grain bullet, as it is with the 22-250, because that's a good balance. They shoot all the bullet weights very well up to 60 grains, but the best, most popular balanced with that speed cartridge tends to be around a 55 grain bullet, because they buck the wind very well, and they get down range with a good trajectory, which is pretty much the same trajectory as a 50 grain bullet, but as I say, with a little bit better wind bucking ability. So anyway, that's about it for the cartridge. Now I want to show you the rifle that beauty goes into. Oh, he's going to have a hard time wresting this out of my hands now that I got it. Just teasing, Peter. He and I have been shooting for many years together. We go back to the first grade. So here we have a Ruger #1, and I can combine this with kind of an introduction to the Ruger #1 too, if you haven't seen it. Unfortunately, you know, this has gone out of, it's phased out of Ruger's stock lineup. It was really their flagship gun for so many years, and going back to the 60s, and it was very popular, rather expensive. It's a very, very high grade piece of machinery. It's got a falling block action. It locks up here at the trigger guard. It just feels like this is a really classy, smooth operating action, single shot. Noted for its strength, extremely strong action. Right now this has got a 2-to-7 power variable on it. It's a Nikon Pro Staff. Very, very nice scope for this gun. Economical. And you know, we don't have extreme long range shooting in New Hampshire, so 7 power is more than sufficient to be able to zero in on anything that we have to shoot around here. You know, this is certainly a cartridge that would do very, very well with up to a 16 power scope. But that's the Ruger number 1. And by the way, this weighs 9.8 pounds with that scope on it. So he doesn't have a set of wheels to go along with it to lug it around the pasture. This is a formidable size gun to carry around all day. But you know, when you're going out into a field and you're looking across an old pasture or something, it's just beautiful. Very nice. This rifle, by the way, goes back to, it was made in 1996 according to the serial number. So they made this right. Very, very accurate gun. Smooth action. The trigger is just absolutely delicious. Beautiful trigger. So that's it. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and God bless.